Hello and welcome everybody to the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara's October 2021 speaker meeting. Let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Dr. John Wathey, also goes by Jack to his friends. I think I can call him Jack now,
Yes,
maybe?
please.
Thank you. And the title of the talk is Narcissism Broke Our Democracy. Can Science and Math Fix It? John is a retired computational biologist whose interests include evolutionary algorithms, the biology of nervous systems, and electoral reform. Those three things don't seem to go together. He earned his PhD in neuroscience at UC San Diego and has spent most of his career working on computer simulations of protein folding. His first book was The Illusion of God's Presence back in 2016, and those of you who were around with our society back in 2017 may remember that he spoke to us in person in April of that year. That book explored the evolution of the emotions and the intuitions behind religious belief. And now he's working on another book, scheduled for release a year from now, the fall of 2022. And that one's going to be called The Phantom God, What Neuroscience Reveals About the Compulsion to Believe. And it will relate the motivating forces behind religiousness to neural development, embodiment, mother-infant bonding, adult sexual pair bonding, addiction, selective attention, hallucinations, and many other neurological surprises. But we're not here to talk about that today. Today we're talking about narcissism broke our democracy. Can science and math fix it? So with that, Jack, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you for those kind words and for the invitation to be here today. This image, by the way, should be familiar to some of you. That was the sunset at Santa Barbara after I gave my talk a few years ago up at Santa Barbara. It's a fun visit. I have fond memories of it. So, narcissism broke our democracy. Can science and math fix it? I meant that title to be provocative, but it might also be confusing, so let me elaborate. When I say our democracy is broken, I am not talking about voter fraud. There is no massive fraud in our elections. We have good safeguards in this country. Winners are legitimately chosen according to our electoral rules. The problem is that our electoral rules are mathematically wrong. They do not correctly measure the will of the majority, especially in the primaries. This is why we often get candidates that most voters dislike. Science and math can help us fix this, but there's another big problem. Charismatic, narcissistic candidates warp the minds of their followers and lead them astray. That's how narcissism breaks democracy. And the problem is not just the narcissism of the politician, but also the way voters are seduced by a narcissist. The bad news is that this problem has deep roots in human nature, so it will always be with us. The good news, however, is that fixing the mathematical problem makes the narcissism problem much less of a threat. My talk will be in 4 parts. In part 1, I'll briefly explain how I got interested in this subject, and part of that story involves a friend of mine shown here on the left. In part 2, I will talk about narcissism and its toxic role in cults, religion, and politics. In part 3, I'll explain what's broken in our electoral system and how science and math might help us fix it. And in part 4, I'll conclude with this question: can we get there from here? Even if we know how to fix our electoral system, can we get around the obstacles to reform? So that's my outline. And now let's move on to part 1. Now, some of you know my book is about religion, so why am I talking about electoral reform? To answer that, I should first say what I am not talking about. This talk is nonpartisan. I'm not arguing for or against any political party or candidate. For example, what's happening in this image is not liberal or conservative. It's not politics at all. This is violent radicalism. We should all want to keep this from happening again. Defending democracy from violent insurrection is not a partisan issue. Neither is electoral reform. Voters and candidates of all political parties need a fair and robust electoral system that reflects the will of the majority. Now, there are places in this talk where I just can't avoid referring to specific politicians, but I will try to do that in a way that's balanced. And in fact, I'll do it right now. This image was taken at a public viewing of a presidential debate in October 2016. A poll taken 6 weeks earlier found that these two candidates were essentially tied as the two least popular presidential candidates in polling history. About 60% of registered voters rated them unfavorable. That means at least 10% of voters, possibly more, disliked both candidates, which says to me that the nomination process had failed. Somehow it had ignored most voters. It was this election, especially the defective nomination process, that got me interested in electoral reform. During that primary season, I wrote an article about it. And I got an intriguing reply from a clever man named Danny Kleinman, shown here on the left when we later met in person. He truly opened my eyes to the flaws in our electoral system. I'll have a lot more to say about him later in the talk. Now, like I said, I'm not advocating any party or candidates here, so my political views are irrelevant. But in the interest of full disclosure, I'll tell you a little bit about them anyway. I'm a left-leaning centrist. I'm conservative on some issues, I'm liberal on others, but above all, I'm a pragmatist. I just want our society to work better. Now, if I had to pick one issue that I care about most, that would be protecting the Earth, because I'm a biologist by training. I'm also a software engineer by profession, so when I see a problem that needs solving, all I care about is fixing it. I'm not an ideologue. I don't care whether the best solution comes from a liberal or a conservative. I just want to fix the problem. But I do care about the truth. As a scientist, I care a lot about accepting empirical evidence and facing reality. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously put it, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. So let's be clear about one salient fact. Biden and Harris won the 2020 presidential election fair and square. This is not a partisan opinion. It's an empirical fact, documented by meticulous record keeping under the eyes of election observers, verified by audits and recounts, certified as accurate by local election officials of both parties, and so ruled by numerous judges, including Supreme Court justices, who rejected frivolous claims to the contrary. Astonishingly, those false claims of election fraud began in April of 2020, months before the first ballot had even been cast, and they continue to this day. It was this big lie that motivated the attackers on January 6th. And none of what I have just said is disputed by honest and rational people across the political spectrum. So I would argue that the attackers in this image were not being rational. They were in denial of reality, following one self-serving man who placed his narrow self-interest above the Constitution. For me, the critical question is, how could they have been so easily fooled? In a word, my answer to that question is narcissism. And that brings us to part two. What is narcissism and how has it broken our democracy? The word comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus, a handsome young man who was so entranced by his reflection that he died of an overdose of self-love. In reality, of course, it's more complicated, and in extreme cases, psychiatrists call it narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. I have known people with NPD all my life, and you probably have too, because it's fairly common. But I did not learn the psychiatric term for it until 2009, when I interviewed a cult survivor, Carol Shelton, as part of the research for my book. Carol was born into a cult. Her father, L.R. Shelton, was a Baptist preacher whose behavior was so extreme and abusive that he was eventually excommunicated from the Southern Baptist Convention. He ruled his congregation with an iron fist, ostracizing anyone who showed the slightest disloyalty, and he demanded extraordinary sacrifices from his followers. Carol's story inspired me to look up her father's symptoms in the psychiatrist's manual, and that was my first clue to this dark and fascinating aspect of human nature. I also read a bunch of memoirs from other cult survivors, and each of them described similar symptoms in their leader, symptoms that all fit the pattern of NPD. So what exactly are those symptoms? Well, I will just quickly list them. Charismatic, domineering, projecting confidence. Insatiable craving for attention and admiration. Grandiose sense of importance, achievement, and entitlement. Boasting and pathological lying. Impulsive, self-indulgent, lack of self-control. Cruelty, exploitation of others, lack of empathy. Demanding costly sacrifice as proof of devotion. Fits of rage when demands are not met. Shallow and unstable relationships. And secret feelings of insecurity, shame, and humiliation. Interestingly, Yahweh checks all the boxes for NPD. Regarding grandiosity, attention-seeking, and secret feelings of insecurity, you need look no further than the first 3 commandments, which are all about massaging God's fragile ego. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not bow down to any graven image, for I am a jealous God. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, and so on. The Bible is just full of examples like these. In my book, I argue that cruel, grandiose, thin-skinned gods like Yahweh were probably modeled after narcissistic tribal leaders of antiquity. And the roots of human narcissism probably go much farther back in time than that. There are striking parallels between NPD and humans and the behavior of alpha males in our closest non-human cousins, the apes. E.O. Wilson puts it this way: true to their primate heritage, people are easily seduced by confident, charismatic leaders, especially males. That predisposition is strongest in religious organizations. Cults form around such leaders. Their power grows if they can persuasively claim special access to the supremely dominant, typically male figure of God. So this suggests that NPD isn't really a disorder at all, but is somehow adaptive, something evolution has selected for in humans and in our distant primate ancestors. After all, alpha male chimps have the best access to mates and other resources needed for reproductive success. Human narcissists often do well too. Their craving for attention may lead them into careers like acting, preaching, or politics, where they often excel. Their confident, charismatic facade makes them attractive as business leaders and lovers. Their marriages might not last, but they may have many of them, and typically many affairs on the side. So is NPD a bug or a feature? Well, one important clue is that NPD is fairly common. This study of 34,000 American adults found that 6.2% had NPD at some time in their lives, with significantly higher prevalence among men than women. This is about 10 times greater than the lifetime prevalence of schizophrenia. And although many of the subjects had NPD only as adolescents, the data suggests that for at least half of NPD subjects, the condition is severe and lasts a lifetime. Another clue is that narcissism is significantly heritable. This twin study of 175 twin pairs examined 18 dimensions of personality disorder. And of those, narcissism was the most heritable, with 64% of the variance in this trait coming from genetic factors. So it looks like NPD really is at least partly a product of evolution. But there's still a deep puzzle here. If NPD contributes to reproductive success, then why are we not all narcissists? And if it is not an adaptation, then why does it persist at such high prevalence? The answer to these questions may lie in a subtle facet of evolutionary theory called frequency-dependent selection, which in this case is really just a fancy way of saying too many chiefs and not enough Indians. Being a malignant narcissist pays off in evolutionary terms only if there are enough people around you who are seduced by your charisma, submit to your dominance, and make sacrifices to prove their loyalty. It doesn't work if everyone is a narcissist, or even if most people are. It also doesn't work if we have all Indians and no chiefs. Evolution appears to be selecting for both, but only in the right proportion. A few leaders and many followers. This means that the narcissistic personality is only half the story of the cult phenomenon. The other half is a complementary personality type, the kind of person who is easily seduced into following a narcissist. So let's turn our attention to them. From my reading of the literature on cults, the people most vulnerable to narcissistic leaders share at least 3 important personality traits: a powerful need to belong, fear of ostracism, and a willingness to sacrifice for a cause greater than themselves. Now, if I'm right about this idea, that evolution has selected for these distinct leader and follower types as the basis for human tribal behavior, then we should expect these follower traits, like the narcissistic ones, to be significantly heritable. And twin studies show that they are. For the need to belong, about 48% of the variance comes across individuals comes from genetic factors. Likewise, for fear of ostracism, and for self-sacrifice, measured as willingness to be an organ donor, the heritability is about 64%. So evolution appears to have shaped human nature in a way to make narcissistic people appealing as leaders. More specifically, it has sprinkled genes across our population in such a way that a few of us have a heritable tendency to be such leaders, while many more have a heritable tendency to fall under their spell. So, what about the claim in my title? How does narcissism break democracy? Well, I will let travel expert Rick Steves answer that question. He uses the word charisma instead of narcissism, but I'm pretty sure he and I are talking about the same thing.
I was in Munich recently, and I saw this photograph, and it haunted me. This is 1932. These are people just like you and me, gathering together, listening to some charismatic politician trying to take them down his road. Looking at that crowd gave me the chills, because I know how a fascist leader with a lot of charisma can capitalize on people's fears and anguish and lead a society astray. We've learned. It's not just Hitler and Germany. Most of Europe went down this road between the two world wars. What was the environment that made Hitler possible? Germany was humiliated in World War I. People were disillusioned. They felt insulted. They wanted to be made strong again, you know? It was the Depression, and people lost their jobs. People wanted a charismatic politician to promise them jobs. There was hardscrabble, downtrodden people who felt that immigrants and people from afar were cutting in front of them in line. There was scapegoating. There was blatant racism. There was a fear of communists, so the capitalist powers endorsed this sort of movement. There is an amazing ability to control the press and to manipulate people through propaganda. There were rallies. There were rallies that just amped up the base, and there was charismatic politicians who could tell lies repeatedly and so convincingly that people followed them. And then they had what every wannabe dictator gets, or dreams for, or prays for, and that is an excuse to turn that democracy into a law and order society, a police state. When you have a 9/11, it lets you circumvent civil liberties and assert your autocracy. In Germany, somebody burned down the Capitol building, and Hitler, from then on out, controlled the whole society. It was incremental, and then it snowballed. Turkey, same sort of thing with Erdogan. Incremental, failed coup, bam, dictator. We need to learn from history. Germany was bamboozled by a charismatic leader, and that country went right into a war that devastated Europe.
I would only add that there were innate as well as environmental factors that made Hitler possible. In any form of cultish tribalism, the narcissism of the leader warps the minds of followers like a hallucinogenic drug. For example, recent polls show that 29% of American adults still believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen through massive voter fraud. That's about 75 million people. That's frightening. Democracy starts to break down if that many people are detached from reality. But there are things we can do about it. We can teach our children to be better critical thinkers, to see through narcissistic bullies rather than to follow them, and to be smarter voters. But that's for the next generation. And unfortunately, our democracy needs help right now. The most effective thing we can do about that is to fix the bugs in our electoral system. Which brings us to part 3. How and why does our electoral system fail to measure the will of the majority, and how can science and math help us fix it? There are many defects in our electoral system. Here's a partial list. The Electoral College. winner-take-all single-seat congressional districts, gerrymandering of congressional districts, the Senate filibuster, corruption in general, and the Citizens United decision in particular, low voter turnout, voter suppression laws, the Supreme Court nomination process, and the astonishing fact that only one person nominates a vice president. Now, if there's anything on that list that you care deeply about, we might have time for it in the Q&A period. But for now, I will turn to another problem. I think the primary defect in American democracy is the primary system. In my view, the primary system is so defective, so anti-democratic, that it should be abolished. But having said that, I realize that reform is best done in small steps. So I will suggest some stopgap fixes to the primaries, but only as part of a grander plan for ultimately abolishing them. But before you can understand the fixes, you need to understand the defects. So let's start with congressional primaries. What's wrong with those? First, they get low turnout, 20 to 35% of eligible adults compared to 50 to 55% in general elections. Also, that low turnout is not a representative sample. They are more ideologically extreme than the general electorate. This polarizes parties and politicians, and so makes incumbents fear a primary challenge more than they fear losing the general election. And that fear of being primaried means that a charismatic president can control representatives and senators by threatening to endorse primary challengers. Primaries are a bad idea at all levels of government. But for the rest of this talk, I will concentrate on the presidential primaries because they are the worst. They're the most dangerous because the presidency is such a powerful office, and anyone can play. In the last two presidential elections, there were 6 candidates in the primaries who had never been elected to any public office. 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. In my judgment, they were all unqualified, and at least one was temperamentally unfit. And of course, as in the other primaries, voters are few and ideologically extreme, but this problem is far worse in presidential primaries because of the staggered primary schedule shown on this map. The darker the color, the earlier and therefore the more influential the primary or caucus. The final outcome is mostly determined by a small and unrepresentative sample of voters in only a few early primary states. But it gets even worse. Even within this tiny set of voters, our system ignores the will of the majority of them because it uses first-past-the-post voting to winnow a large field of contenders. Now, you've probably heard the first 3 criticisms in this list, but maybe not the last one. It's really a math problem, and math problems don't often make the news. But this one should, because first-past-the-post voting gives the wrong answer. It's like hitting the plus key on a pocket calculator when you meant to press square root. It just gives the wrong answer. The term first past the post comes from an intuitively appealing but incorrect analogy we often apply to elections, namely the horse race. How do we decide which horse is faster? We line them up, we run a race, and the first one past the finish line is the winner. How do we decide which candidate is preferred by the voters? We ask the voters to pick a favorite, and the one with the most votes wins. The analogy is deceptively appealing because if we only have 2 candidates, it actually gives the right answer. Unless the vote is an exact tie, one candidate will get more than 50% and so represents the will of the majority. But what if we have more than 2 contenders? For the horse race problem, first past the post still gives the right answer. The first one past the finish line really is the fastest horse. But for the voting problem, it absolutely does not give the right answer. It only tells you which candidate gets a plurality of first choice votes. And that is not necessarily the candidate who is most preferred by a majority of voters. The problem is that when you have more than 2 candidates, first past the post does not take in enough information from the voters to determine which candidate they truly prefer. Now, to illustrate this, let's go back to Rick Steves' example, Germany in 1932. In July of that year, Germans held their parliamentary election. In Weimar Germany, people didn't vote for specific representatives. Instead, they voted for their favorite political party. So this was first past the post voting at the level of parties, of which there were many. And here's the result. The Nazi Party won a plurality, a little over a third of the seats. And why did they stand out like this in such a large field of contenders? Because of Hitler's confident, charismatic, and narcissistic appeal, everything Rick Steves talked about. Among a significant minority, he was an object of cult worship. And in first-past-the-post voting, with this many contenders, you only need to stand out a little bit to win. Nearly two-thirds voted against him, but they had no way to specify on their ballots which party most of them, as a group, preferred to the Nazis. This defective election made Hitler's rise to the chancellorship possible. It was one of those incremental steps toward dictatorship. So how can we avoid that fate? Or to put it another way, what is the mathematically correct way to decide an election with more than two contenders? The problem was solved in 1785 by French mathematician Nicolas de Condorcet, and the essence of it is just two simple steps. Step one, convert the multi-candidate contest into a series of two-candidate contests. For example, here's a four-way contest among candidates Grant, Jones, Lee, and Smith. For simplicity, I will represent them by their initials. There are 6 possible pairings of any 4 things, so our four-way race becomes 6 pairwise contests. And the reason for doing this, of course, is that a two-way race is unambiguous. The winner clearly represents the will of the majority. Next, we have to combine in some way the results of these pairwise contests, and that is step 2. The candidate who defeats all other contenders in pairwise contests wins the election. This is called the Condorcet Criterion, and the candidate who satisfies it is called the Condorcet candidate or the Condorcet winner. This is mathematically precise and intuitively clear. If you defeat all other candidates in pairwise contests with each of them, then you really are preferred by the majority of voters, and you truly deserve to win. I can't overemphasize the importance of this slide. How should we decide an election with more than 2 contenders? The Condorcet method. Burn that answer into your cortex. This could save our democracy someday, if we have the wisdom to implement it. There is, however, one little fly in the ointment. What if no candidate satisfies the Condorcet criterion? It's possible that no candidate will win all of his or her pairwise contests. Well, luckily, in real-world elections, where candidates and voters align themselves on a political spectrum, this will rarely happen. And when it does, we can find an almost Condorcet candidate, the one who comes closest to meeting the criterion. But there's another potential problem. What if we have too many candidates? In principle, the number of pairwise comparisons we need to make is proportional to the square of the number of candidates. So it looks like we need to run lots of pairwise elections if we have more than just a few candidates. Here's a real example of 17 candidates, the Republican primary field of 2016. For simplicity, I'll just represent them by the first 17 letters of the alphabet. To convert this 17-way contest into multiple pairwise contests requires 136 distinct pairs. Well, obviously, running that many pairwise elections would be a logistical nightmare. Luckily, however, we don't need to. We can do the mathematical equivalent in a much simpler way and in one election, but only if we collect enough information from the voters on their ballots. And here is what that ballot looks like. A ranked choice ballot collects all the information we need. In any race involving more than 2 candidates, the ballot should ask the voter to rank all candidates from most to least preferred. Here's an example of how one voter might fill it in. The main point here is that this tells us how this voter would have voted if we had run all possible pairwise elections involving these candidates. Here again are those 6 pairings now listed vertically. And for the first pair, Grant versus Jones, the voter prefers Jones in second place, now shown in red, to Grant in third place, now shown in blue. So Jones gets the vote, which I've now indicated in the tally on the right. And you can simply read each of the voters' pairwise preferences in this way directly from the ballot. I'll just quickly run through them. Grant versus Lee, Grant versus Smith, Jones versus Lee, and Jones versus Smith, and finally Lee versus Smith. Now imagine repeating this process for thousands of ballots, each time adding to the pairwise vote counts in these two columns. The result might look something like this. And if you study this for a while, you might notice that one candidate wins all three of his pairwise contests. That candidate is Smith. Smith beats Grant, Smith beats Jones, and Smith beats Lee. Smith is the Condorcet winner, the one who is truly the candidate preferred by the majority of voters. Now, at this point, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I've heard about ranked choice voting. That's not how it works. Nobody said anything about breaking it up into pairwise contests. You're supposed to do a series of instant runoff elections. So whatever happened to instant runoff voting, or IRV as it's sometimes abbreviated? Well, first, let's get our terminology straight. The phrase ranked choice voting refers only to the structure of the ballot. Once you have a stack of ranked choice ballots, there are many different ways to choose a winner from them. Instant runoff is the most popular way to do ranked choice voting, but only one of many and not the best. Its greatest strength, and the reason it's so popular, is a psychological one. It's popular because it seems familiar. Voters understand runoff elections. But that's also its greatest weakness. In instant runoff, if no candidate wins a majority of first choice votes, the candidate with the fewest first choice votes gets rejected. And candidates ranked below him on the ballots all move up to take his place, and then you repeat the process. So when it rejects a candidate, instant runoff ignores most of the information on the ballots because it ignores everything below the first rank. For that reason, instant runoff is not guaranteed to find the Condorcet winner, though it usually does. Another problem is that instant runoff does not allow tied rankings on the ballot. So any ballots marked that way are rejected as invalid. That, in my view, is a serious defect. For these and other reasons, instant runoff is not a robust voting algorithm. And that's why many experts advocate the Condorcet method instead. And in saying method singular, I've glossed over an important detail. There are many different Condorcet methods for ranked choice voting. Here, for example, are 4 excellent ones, my personal favorites, each with advantages and disadvantages. All are guaranteed to find the Condorcet winner when there is one. Mathematically, they differ in how they cope with those rare cases in which there is no Condorcet winner. And because those situations are so rare, these mathematical differences are relatively unimportant. Far more important, though, is the psychological factor I was just talking about. Can voters understand it? By that criterion, one of these 4 stands out as a clear winner, and that takes us back to my chance encounter with Danny Kleinman. Danny and I became online pen pals because of an article I wrote about electoral reform. He sent me one of his articles in reply. Back in the 1950s, when he was studying math at Oberlin College, the Student Election Committee sought Danny's advice on running elections, and this led him into the mathematics of voting. He quickly saw glaring defects in the most popular methods like instant runoff and decided there had to be a better way. He derived his own voting algorithm from scratch, which he calls SUM, an acronym for Single Office Majority Election. The word majority is there to emphasize that SUM is a Condorcet method. It respects the will of the majority. And as Condorcet methods go, SUM is relatively simple. It avoids all those separate pairwise tallies we were doing earlier. And it has other nice properties too, but I want to emphasize here the psychological one. SUM is easy for voters to grasp, at least as easy as instant runoff. I'll explain why in a minute, but first I need to explain why I'm going to stop calling it SUM. Decades after Danny worked it out, he discovered that an Australian astronomer and mathematician, Joseph M. Baldwin, had invented and published the identical algorithm in 1926. So to give credit where it's due, I will call it the Baldwin method, but I still give Danny credit for opening my mind to new ideas on electoral reform. Okay, so here's why the Baldwin method is easy for voters to grasp. First of all, it does repeated eliminations of candidates, like instant runoff, so it feels familiar. Voters know what a runoff election is all about. Unlike instant runoff, however, the Baldwin method always eliminates the least relevant candidate, the one who is ranked lowest on average, and voters understand the virtue of doing that. By contrast, instant runoff sometimes rejects the most relevant candidate, the Condorcet winner. That's rare, but it has happened in real elections. The reason it can happen, like I said, is that when it's picking a candidate to reject, instant runoff ignores all the information on the ballots other than the first choice votes. To see how the Baldwin method works, let's return to our previous example. Grant, Jones, Lee, and Smith. Here again is the first ballot. And rather than worry about pairwise contests like we did a few minutes ago, Baldwin gives each candidate a score that indicates how preferred that candidate is relative to the others. A larger score means more preferred. Specifically, a candidate's score is simply the number of contenders ranked below him. Here I've listed them in order by this particular voter's preference, from most preferred at the top to least preferred at the bottom. And over here on the right, I'll be putting the scores. So let's go ahead and get started calculating these scores. There are 3 candidates ranked below Smith, so Smith gets a score of 3. There are 2 candidates below Jones, so Jones gets a 2. There's 1 candidate below Grant, so Grant gets a 1. And no one is below Lee, so Lee gets 0. And yes, it really is that simple. Now let's start a tally over here on the right where I've listed the candidates alphabetically. We'll add up the scores from all the ballots here on the right, and we'll count them up at the top. So let's add the numbers from this first ballot, which I've shown here in red. We do the arithmetic, and now we're done with the first ballot. Let's do another one. This one's a little different. You'll notice that Grant and Jones are tied for second place, as I've emphasized in green. Again, I've listed them in order by this voter's preference, but now Grant and Jones are on the same line because they're tied. And by the way, if we were using instant runoff, we'd have to discard this ballot because of that tie. But we're using Baldwin, so let's keep going and do the scores. Smith has 3 candidates below him, so he gets a 3. Grant and Jones have 1 candidate below them, so they each get a 1 for that. But a draw is better than a loss. So each tied candidate should get a little extra credit for not being defeated by the other candidates in the tie. Now, the way we handle that is to give each tied candidate an extra half a point for every other candidate in the tie. So in this particular example, Jones gets an extra half a point for being tied with Grant, and Grant gets an extra half a point for being tied with Jones. And again, nobody is below Lee, so he gets a 0. Now we add the scores from this ballot to the totals on the right, as we did before, do the arithmetic, and now we're done with 2 ballots. Now imagine doing this for thousands of ballots. The tallies on the right might look something like this. Now at this point, you might be tempted to pick the highest scoring candidate as our winner, but it turns out he's not guaranteed to be the Condorcet winner. All we know with mathematical certainty is that the Condorcet winner must have a higher than average score, and so cannot be the lowest scoring candidate. So that's the one we're really interested in. And in this case, that's Lee. We eliminate Lee at this point because he has the lowest score. He cannot possibly be the Condorcet winner we're looking for. And notice that all of the information from all of the ballots has gone into this decision because that's how these scores were calculated. So now Lee is gone and the tally on the right has been reset to all zeros. Now we repeat the process with the remaining candidates and we ignore any eliminated ones. We go through all the ballots, add up the scores on the right again, and then eliminate the candidate with the lowest total scores. We just keep doing this till we run out of candidates. Just to save time, I'm going to skip ahead to the end of the last cycle when we have only 2 candidates left. And at that point in time, Jones has the lower score, and so he is eliminated. The last remaining candidate is guaranteed to be the Condorcet winner if there is one. And if there isn't, the last surviving candidate is arguably the one closest to meeting the Condorcet criterion. So that's how the Baldwin method works. And now that I have buried you in mathematical details, let's step back and look at the big picture again. Would the Baldwin method have saved Germany in 1932 if they had had direct election of the chancellor using ranked choice ballots and a robust voting method like Baldwin? Would Hitler have lost? My guess is probably yes, but we'll never know for sure. All we know is that the Nazis never won a majority of the vote in any of the 5 big elections held that year, so Baldwin might well have saved the day. But of course, what we really care about is here and now. What electoral reforms would save American democracy now? What system would best protect us from narcissistic demagogues? Well, experts disagree, but here's what I suggest. Abolish the primaries and use the Baldwin method to choose the president in one national election. Now, doing this also abolishes the Electoral College, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, that requires a constitutional amendment, which means that none of this will happen anytime soon. And that brings us to part 4. Can we get there from here? Are the obstacles insurmountable? When I discuss electoral reform, I usually hear objections like these. The nation is too polarized for major reform. Your suggestion is unconstitutional. Parties have a right to choose nominees however they wish. There would be too many candidates in the general election. It's too complicated. Voters won't accept it. Nobody would trust the results. Well, my answer to most of these objections is that in many places, people already use ranked choice voting and they like it. Ranked choice voting is used in national and/or local elections by every single voter in Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Malta. And right here in America, some states use it for statewide and presidential elections, for presidential primaries, for local elections, party elections, and for military and overseas voting. Ranked choice voting is a sound, mainstream idea with popular and growing support. As for the Constitution being an obstacle, the Constitution says nothing about political parties or primaries. Originally, it also said nothing about voting rights, which turned out to be a glaring defect that had to be fixed. Fortunately, the Constitution was designed to be fixed when defects become apparent, but unfortunately, it still has serious defects that are now painfully obvious. As for parties being wedded to the primary system, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy it. The primary system in its present form has only existed since the 1990s. For most of our history, party bosses chose nominees in smoke-filled rooms, and they fiercely resisted primary elections, only relenting in a big way in the 1960s. And there's a deeper point to be made here. Abolishing the primaries should appeal to parties and politicians if they just think about it for 5 minutes. Why put all your eggs in one basket? The current system forces each party to do that for the general election. Think back to early fall of 2016. Wouldn't it have been nice for Republicans if, after Trump's Access Hollywood tape and his attacks on the Gold Star Con parents, voters had the option of voting for Jeb Bush or John Kasich in the general election? Wouldn't it have been nice for Democrats if, after Clinton's email scandal, voters had the option of voting for Joe Biden or maybe Sheldon Whitehouse? And wouldn't it be nice for congressional representatives of both parties if they could stop worrying about being primaried by extremists and focus instead on the needs of their constituents? The only real objection that I can foresee from party leaders is that any form of ranked choice voting would weaken the stranglehold of the two major parties. And they like having that stranglehold. For the rest of us, of course, getting rid of that stranglehold would be a good thing. After all, we are the metaphorical rodent in this image. As psychologist Jonathan Haidt wisely points out, the second worst number of political parties to have is 2. The worst number, of course, is 1. That's a dictatorship. But having only 2 is almost as bad because it triggers tribalistic emotions. Us versus them, good versus evil. We're Americans and they're traitors. That's the toxic cultishness we discussed earlier. Having 3 or 4 viable parties tamps down a lot of that binary emotion. And the Baldwin method would not merely give us more parties. More importantly, the Baldwin method would give the system evolvability. Evolution doesn't just select for reproductive success. There is also indirect selective pressure for anything that increases the rate of adaptation to the environment. Sexual reproduction is a great example of this. Species that have it adapt more rapidly than those that don't. That's evolvability. Electoral systems need that too. Ossified parties must be replaceable by newer, more responsive ones. In evolution, extinction is a feature, not a bug. And here's another good lesson from evolution. Big changes are best made in small steps. We should use that strategy in pursuing electoral reform because it's the best way to overcome big obstacles. For example, there's a really helpful first step we could take that does not require a constitutional amendment. We could replace our presidential primary system with one national primary that uses the Baldwin method. Of course, there would still be problems with this, like the Electoral College, which would still affect the general election. But there would also be real improvements. Turnout would probably be much greater and more representative than in our current staggered system, which means that moderate candidates would be more likely to win and polarization might start to decline. Also, more voters would learn the new system. They'd get to vote for minor party candidates without worrying about wasting their votes. And they could imagine what it would be like to abolish the primary altogether and use this method for the general election. And best of all, narcissistic demagogues would probably lose. So yes, I think we can get there from here. It won't all happen overnight, but there are realistic steps we can take that lead to a more robust and fair electoral system. As a nation, we need to have a serious conversation about electoral reform. We cannot allow something like this to happen again. And if you'd like to learn more about this subject, I've written several articles and blog posts that are related to this, which you can find at this website. And if you'd like to learn more about the importance of using a Condorcet method, I very highly recommend this website at Princeton University. Okay, great. Well, let me turn off the sharing of the screen here.
Right. See if there's any questions. Robert, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you very much for this talk. I wrote an article on this about a year ago. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. One is that some of the voting systems that I researched, there were ways to game it. And I wonder if you could say something about that. And the other thing is that you keep talking about moderates versus extremists. And I'm thinking about the climate crisis. Moderates are useless. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on those two things.
Okay, I'll try to remember those questions. The first one, yes, you're quite right. There are ways to game some voting algorithms, and some of them are much more vulnerable to that than others. First past the post, by the way, the one we're currently using and have used for the history of our country, is one of the most vulnerable to gaming the system. The instant runoff algorithm is vulnerable to it also. That's another one of its weaknesses. The phrase that's often used in the mathematical literature on that is strategic voting, when you vote in a way that's insincere so as to bias the outcome more in some way. So yeah, some algorithms are very sensitive to that. One of the reasons I like the Baldwin method is that it is extremely difficult to game the Baldwin method. There was a paper published about this a few years ago, and I think I cited in one of my articles. It's the mathematical phrase for it is the difficulty of gaming the Baldwin method is NP hard. Mathematically, it's an extremely difficult problem, almost intractable. So difficult that in practice, you basically don't need to worry about it. So it's a very robust method in that regard. There are other ones too. Baldwin isn't the only really nice method, but like I said in the talk, it has the advantage of being simple, really easy to explain. Oh, and you asked about moderates being useless in some issues that require drastic solutions. My feeling about that is that I think I've heard this criticism in another respect. One criticism I heard of the Condorcet method, written by an advocate of instant runoff, was when he was trying to rationalize the failure of instant runoff to find the Condorcet candidate, and he said that Condorcet favors the middle of the spectrum, and therefore that's not necessarily what the voters want. Sometimes the voters want something more extreme. Well, I actually disagree with his criticism. I disagree with his rationalization about it. I guess my short answer to your question is that as the needs become apparent, as the severity of the problem of global warming becomes apparent, what used to be considered a fringe part of the political spectrum suddenly becomes the center, the mass of public sentiment will move towards reform when it just becomes obvious that we have to do this. And we've actually seen recently a dramatic movement in the sort of the will of the majority on a completely different, unrelated issue, being gay marriage. Gay marriage was, 20 years ago, unthinkable. It was just a completely outrageous idea. And in a very short amount of time, most of American society has come around to realize, if you just think about this a while, there doesn't seem to be any good reason to prohibit it, and a lot of good reasons to allow it. and we just shifted that way. And what I would argue is we are safest, we are always safest and better off if we honor the will of the majority of voters. I guess I have faith in the wisdom of crowds that eventually, as a whole, the electorate will gravitate towards what we as a society need to do for the betterment of all of us.
Thanks. There's a comment from Jim Balter in the chat, and he brings up distribution of wealth, the influence of power and wealth on the system, the Citizens United ruling, and suggesting that what Trump had behind him was the wealth not because they were influenced by his charisma, but because they would give him what they wanted in terms of lower taxes, Supreme Court justices, things like that.
Well, let me start first. I'll just say that I agree very much with the sentiment of the question, that problem of the influence of money on politics is terrible. It's one of the most severe. It's right up there near the top of what we need to fix, and it's also one of the most intractable. It's very hard to work out how to fix it. And on this subject, I'd like to relate a suggestion from Danny Kleinman, my mentor in this subject. He's wrote a small book, a thin, very concise book on this subject. Just full, it's dense, absolutely dense with rich ideas on fixing problems in our electoral system. And he addresses this one. His suggestion is that we were completely wrong-headed in the idea of having transparency in the source of funding that goes to candidates. His suggestion was, he said that gets the incentives backwards. What we need to do is to allow people to contribute to political candidates, but keep the source of the contributions secret. If there was a way to do that, now that's the problem. I'm not sure how to do this in practice, but if it were possible to do this in practice, if there were a way that we could have a system where people could make their campaign contributions into some kind of escrow account managed by some organization that does only this, some government agency, whatever, that does only this, and keep absolutely secret from the candidates where their contributions are coming from, that would help a lot. There may be some other more practical approach that achieves kind of the same thing. But however it's done, I agree, we must find some way to reduce the influence of money on politics. I don't claim to have an ideal solution to it.
Hal, you have a question?
Dr. Wathey, it's not clear to me if we really wanted to implement ranked choice voting, where would the best place to start be? Can it be done on a county-by-county basis? Would it have to be statewide, or does it have to be national?
Well, certainly you can do it it can definitely be done on a local basis, but of course only for local elections, for things like city council or county supervisors or the governor, if you do it on a statewide level, whatever. And many states and localities in our country have done that already. There are places that are using ranked choice voting. Just a few years ago, Maine instituted ranked choice voting for their gubernatorial elections. And the reason they did it was that they, for a couple of election cycles, their vote had been relatively evenly split among three candidates, one Republican, one Democrat, and one independent. So no one won the governorship with a majority of votes. And basically, the majority of voters in Maine just despised the governor. He was incompetent. And this happened twice in a row. And so they just decided, enough. There's something wrong with our voting system. It obviously is not reflecting the will of the majority. So they did that, and they're one of the they love it. They, as far as I know, they really like ranked choice voting on the state level. So yes, I think it can and should be done at the local level. I think that's a great place to start.
Any other questions? It's okay, Bill Cook.
Well, there must be something adaptive about tribalism if it has been so powerful in not only animal but human evolution.
Yeah, you're very, very astute to point that out. And I kind of glossed over that in the talk because I had too many other things to talk about. But you're absolutely right. There's a fairly significant literature on this. And yes, there is this tribalism, this dynamic between kind of this dominant kind of personality, the sort of alpha male personality, and people in the tribe kind of falling behind, getting in line, sacrificing for the good of the group, all of that. That's a dynamic that does appear to happen and does appear to be very important in human hunter-gatherer cultures. I should, though, since we're on the subject, point out that cults, where we see this kind of dynamic nowadays, mostly in cults, where a person who has this extreme narcissistic personality sort of gets a bunch of other people under his spell and controls them and directs them and usually ends up abusing them in some horrible way. That's not what happens in hunter-gatherer societies. In hunter-gatherer societies, there's kind of a cultural norm where, okay, we will follow this dominant leader, and we will even go into battle against the competing tribe that's been stealing our resources or whatever. We will do that, but we won't let him do just anything. It's sort of a cultural norm to restrain their tribal leaders and depose them if necessary. So in the kind of natural environment in which humans evolved, this kind of tribalism worked fairly well. In modern society, it sort of turns into or degenerates into this cult-like phenomenon where the leader is given unbridled control over people and does a lot of damage. If it happens on the scale of a nation, as it did in Nazi Germany, it's colossal, catastrophic damage. So it's kind of become a pathological thing. But in our early prehistory, I think it was adaptive and it was a part of our social nature to do this.
Ed is asking, can you explain again why ranked choice voting would have it likely that narcissists would lose? Can you explain that part again?
That's just on the assumption that it's a minority of the population that's really seduced by the charisma. It's a minority who really very enthusiastically support him. But I guess the Nazi Germany example is I think a good one. If you could have given all of those voters in 1932 in Germany the chance to rank all of the parties by their preference, you probably would have had a Condorcet winner that was not the Nazis. Even in 1932, the Nazis had a pretty bad reputation among most of the citizenry. They were seen as thugs, as violent, gangsters, hooligans, whatever. They did a lot of street violence. They were notorious for having had a coup attempt in the 1920s, the so-called beer hall putsch, where they would go together and have these great big rallies and get everybody worked up and get drunk and then go out and start a riot. So they weren't all that universally popular among the populace. I think. I'm kind of inferring this. I don't know for sure, of course.
Marion, you've got a question?
I just wanted to say, I think this has been a terrific program. I want to thank you so much for doing this. I'm interested in maybe how we can get people involved in asking our county to do the next election, say for county supervisors this way. And I'm just putting out a invitation. If other people are interested, maybe we can get a group to go together. And I don't even know who you would start with. And maybe Dr. Wathey, you could help us figure out
how to go about it.
Yeah.
What I can do, I can point you in the right direction. I'm not an activist in this myself, but there's an organization called fairvote.org. fairvote.org. It's a nationwide organization, but they mostly are helping localities to do exactly what you're talking about. You can find them online. They have a bunch of articles explaining the virtues of ranked choice voting. Now, I'll throw in an aside here that they are advocating instant runoff, which I think is not the best algorithm for doing ranked choice voting, but it's much better, much, much better than first past the post or plurality voting. So even if you just do instant runoff voting, you're making huge progress. So they would give you, I think, good advice on how to go about it.
Great. Okay, Jules.
Yeah, could you comment on the California, when we had I can't think of the term right now,
the open primary?
The recall.
The referendum or the
recall election, yeah, where somebody was poised to win with like 20% of the vote.
Well, you've triggered two associations in my mind. I'll start with the recall election. When the recall election was announced or was hitting the news or whatever, I got an email from Danny Kleinman about it, a very humorous, he wrote a little humorous article about it, about how absolutely absurd this is. It's a terrible defect in our electoral system here that it's possible even to do what happened in this recall, that such a small group of voters could instigate this thing, and once it started, once it reaches the threshold so that it actually goes to the point of becoming an election, we are terribly restricted in our choices. We only have, we keep the governor, or we elect from a long list of basket cases, basically. That was a dangerous situation. That could have gone much, much worse than it did. So that's a serious defect. It would really, really be nice to fix that somehow. There are many ways you could do it. You could raise the threshold for how many votes have to be, how many signatures have to be on the petition before it becomes an election, or you could just do away with the idea of the recall altogether, because what you really want is an impeachment mechanism. If the governor does something just colossally, corrupt, then you impeach him, and there should be a mechanism for that in the legislature. But doing it this way is terrible. The other association that your question triggered for me was the California open primary system. That was touted as a nice reform, but I don't think it is. I think it causes more problems than it solves. I remember very vividly the experience, 2018, I think it was, the midterm election there. Trump had just been elected president 2 years earlier. The Democrats were kind of in the resurgence, as often happens in a midterm election. And there was a lot of enthusiasm among Democrats to run for various offices, for governor, for districts, congressional representatives, and so on. So you would very often, several of these races have a situation where there were, 6, 8 Democratic candidates in the primary running against one Republican, or 2 maybe. If it's just one, that one Republican actually has a huge advantage in first past the post voting, just because all of the Republicans would get together and agree on that one candidate. The same thing, the identical same thing, of course, could happen the other direction. You could have, in another situation, another set of circumstances, you could have the Republicans very enthusiastic. This might even happen in the upcoming midterm election when we have a Democratic president. You might have the Republicans flooding the primary ballots with candidates and only one Democratic candidate running. So you'd have the opposite situation, but it's just as unfair, where this top 2 system, just top 2 combined with first past the post voting, utterly undermines the will of the majority. So doing some kind of ranked choice voting in the primary would help a lot.
Do you have any comments on the initiative process, where you want something done, you get people to sign for it, and then
I basically don't like it. It's my personal opinion. There have been some initiative statutes that I think served a useful purpose. But I think it's best to leave the construction of laws to the professionals, to to legislators. That's why they're there. We're supposed to have, we should have a significant fraction of them with some legal background, some experience in doing this, and I think we should kind of leave it to them. If just anybody can write a law and get a bunch of signatures for it, it could be a really poorly thought out law that just
unintended consequences.
with lots of unintended consequences, but it inflames a lot of emotions and passions, and so it gets a lot of signatures and gets on the ballot. So that's my feeling about that.
Thank you. Marion, do you have another question? Your hand is raised.
I just wanted to say that when talking about the recall, the Little Hoover Commission is doing hearings right now for the next couple of weeks on what can be done to change the California Constitution to make the recall system better than this awful thing that we have. And it was fascinating. The first meeting was on Monday, and there will be another one on this Monday, where they bring in experts that really know this stuff. And it was very fascinating. It took about 2 hours, and they have it on their site the way you do, Judy, the way you put the speeches up and people can listen if they've missed it. Anybody who missed it can go to the Little Hoover Commission website. I don't know if it's immediately playable. I think it's pretty quick that they have it available. And it's very worthwhile listening to. And we have a situation here in Santa Barbara where we're going to probably split the Democratic vote 3 ways for mayor, and might give it to the other guy who's the one who's not a Democrat.
Thanks for those comments. Okay, are there any other questions? I don't see any other hands raised. Positive comments in the chat. Jack, thank you so much. This was really a very engaging talk, appropriate for election season.
Well, thank you.
I really
I hope,
appreciate you coming here.
I'm grateful to do it, and I hope I didn't overwhelm you with too many numbers and things like that. It's pretty intense, I know, in places.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. This is applause.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. This was a great presentation. I appreciate all of your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at the COVID talk in 2 weeks.